Good morning, Upper Sixth. So this is the first unit in the Upper Sixth, presuming that you've revised the entire Lower Sixth. As we have discussed in class last year, this is a spiral curriculum and we're sort of expecting you to understand the first year. We will give you an opportunity to revise, but it's down to you to fill any gaps and ask for help if needed. Okay, so we're going on to globalization. We're looking at the growing economies unit, and this is an opportunity really for us to think about what opportunities are there for UK businesses in growing economies, or those growing economies using their newfound wealth to come to the UK. We see a lot of this with Chinese investors, for example, coming into the UK. The UK is now the biggest country attracting FDI in the world. Okay, that's recent shift. We were second, we're now first. We'll see if that continues. So just because we're an established economy, it doesn't mean there's not massive amounts of opportunity for investment. Okay, the new Labour Party have just come into power and they're talking about changing how the stock market works to make it more attractive for businesses to stay here instead of starting up in a very generous economy and then leaving the FTSE to go to NASDAQ, for example, in the United States, where they probably get more value for money at the moment. So we will look through. I'm not going to read the bullet points for you. You can read the screen. This is a big unit. We're going to take 2 weeks to teach it, so the video is going to be long. Okay, 1.5 times speed on the video, and this is really for people who have missed the lessons. So first thing we're going to ask in class is, which do you think are the biggest economies in the world? Well, there's different ways of measuring big. Yet we'll look at GDP quite a lot, and we'll look at the components of GDP, so the bits that are in there, the formula that helps us calculate it. But if we think about it, we've got military expenditure, for example, at the top here. Well, Angola was, in 1988, as a percentage of their GDP, they were the highest expenditure. Well, they had a civil war at the time, and you can see there are other countries there that are obviously spending a lot of money in comparison to their GDP. Okay, so I don't think Angola were actually having a lot going on with GDP at the time either. But 20.1% is huge. And I can't remember what the UK is spending at the moment, but it's about 2.4, I think. So if we think about the fastest growing economy, well, in 1969, when Saudi Arabia had newfound wealth with huge amounts of oil and the new technology to get the oil out of the ground in a more cost-effective way, we could see that they were growing at 46% compared to the global average of 4.4. And you'll notice that in here we're going to look at two models, Mint and BRICS. These are emerging market models. Each letter stands for a country, and we can see we've got Nigeria and China that actually factor into those acronyms. So we'll talk about these emerging markets, but at the time China was growing 18.7% in 1969, which is rapid if you think the world comparison is 4.4. France was the top tourist destination. It's still very high at the moment. And what we're seeing is a rapid change. So, for example, domestic tourism, so Chinese people travelling around China, has rapidly increased in recent years, and that has propelled China to the top of this table. But there's also a huge amount of Chinese consumers that are now travelling the world because you've got the middle class and upper class that have got a lot more money, and there's a lot more of them now. So they're looking to travel the world. Okay, but there's other lesser destinations that are still very popular. Okay, so GDP. Now, if we look here, this is the traditional method of measuring growth. That's what we would normally look at, but there's lots of other factors as we're exploring in this slide. But USA were top for GDP, and they still are. Okay, but if you look for second third, fourth, and fifth, actually this table is turned on its head. So we know that China is second. We've got India that is just behind the United Kingdom at the moment. And very quickly, India will overtake the United Kingdom, and China are on track to be the largest economy on the planet within the next 20 years. So, top for GDP growth for 2023. So we've got some, up-to-date figures. At this point, I'm hoping if you're watching the video because you've missed the lessons, you're guessing which country this is, and of course, it's Macau, which is really part of China, and the Chinese government have come up with some very attractive policies, helping small businesses, opening up the economy for tourism through gambling and stuff like that. So there's lots of stuff going on over there, and this might be a brilliant opportunity. So, for example, we've got some brilliant architecture companies, architects in the UK, and maybe the French, for example, maybe they can get in on training up lots of people to be Michelin star chefs, for example. Okay, or it might be our friends from La Roche and Glion in Switzerland, and Marbella, of course, who may be training people up to be chefs. So there's lots of opportunities here for international trade between countries. So what factors might we measure to decide if the economy is growing? And basically what I'm going to get you to do is I'd like you to pause, and then I'll put some answers up, which I'm not going to read through all of them, or that'll just get very monotonous. So here are all the factors that we will or have researched in class in our pairs. Now what I'd like you to do is to pause the video, define the key terms, and think about how we would measure it. So for example, we've got CPI here. There's other indexes as well, by the way. We'll talk about those in class, but the main one we're thinking about when we're talking about inflation is that basket of goods that's going up in price. Some might be going down in price, but generally inflation's going up. It's recently come under control, but obviously during COVID and other things, oil crisis, wars, grain shortages because of war in Ukraine, those sorts of things. We're looking at how to measure that. Pause the video and do the work. So here are the answers, which I'm not going to go through. You can read the screen. Remember, you need notes that are good enough for you to be able to revise from. So this is your list of definitions. We're thinking that you should also have pros and cons for all of these. So when we're thinking about employment rates, I'll go through another one as well. If we're thinking about employment rates, well, it's really good that unemployment rates are very low at the moment. That means more people have got money, more people will spend that money in the economy. That creates jobs itself, and we're all sort of happy. The problem is, when we've got really low unemployment rates, then employers go into competition for employees. If they're going into competition for them, then it's normally through wage rates. If wage rates go up, this is one of those things that might appear in our inflation, because if people have got more money, then they'll go out and spend money. If they're spending money, maybe prices go up in the economy. If the prices go up in the economy, we see inflation. Okay, so there's two of those indicators that work together, and there's lots of others that work together as well. But actually, this is all linked. Okay, there are pros and cons to all of these. I'd like you to pause the video, and I'd like you to go back in to your notes and add in advantages and disadvantages to each of these. Okay, GDP, bit of a tip. If our GDP is growing too quickly, not quite sure what too quickly is, by the way, the government target is 2%. If it grows too quickly, this might actually increase inflation. Okay, also, there's only a certain amount of capacity that we have in the economy, and down here we've got capacity utilization. If we overstretch the economy too much, then that could become inflationary as well. Pause the video. Advantages, disadvantages. So, your research task is to pop on to the CIA fact book. As we know, CIA are the Central Intelligence Agency, but they've got some brilliant stuff online and a relatively up-to-date analysis of different countries' economies, political or social, all those sorts of things. And in your Theme 3 unit, and you had a taster at the end of last year, at the end of the lower sixth, you looked at PESEL. So obviously all of those political, economic, social, technological, environmental and legal factors, you're going to find all of those on the CIA fact book. Go online, have a bit of a research and think about these BRICS countries and the Mint countries. Okay, each of those letters stands for an emerging market country. And what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to compare it to the UK. This is not a quick activity. We're probably going to spend 20 minutes on it in class, and then we're going to argue about it for probably the rest of the lesson. Go away and do your research. As a bit of a hint, which I'm sure you've already worked out, the BRIC and Mint countries, here are some flags for you. Pause the video, go away and do the research. You need to know, for example, how rapidly GDP is growing compared to the UK, which means UK companies that want to grow, if they're in a stagnant, slow-growing market in the UK, then maybe they want to go to India. Okay, so we're on to another group presentation, another research task. So macroeconomic objectives are government goals. Now, you are probably going to get an exam question in paper 3 or paper 1 on a government motive. So it could be the classic one I talk about in class is when Pfizer moved to Ireland because of tax purposes, and it was all about, should the Irish government encourage multinational corporations to relocate to the Irish economy, assess the likely impact or evaluate the likely impact, can't remember off the top of my head, on the local and national economy. Now, we will look at country as a market, country as a production location as a separate unit, but this all comes back into the macroeconomic objectives. Now, if it was a normal A-level essay, you'd be looking for the aims and objectives of the organisation or the hook in the question. It's exactly the same when you're doing a country-based question, and all you need to do is you need to think about the aims. Now, if the aims aren't in the case study, they're not always, you need to know the aims. Well, the aims are the macroeconomic objectives. We've already talked about one, which was economic growth. So you can go away, research those, and then think about how they are measured. Then I've given you the formula for GDP, or aggregate demand, if you are studying economics, same thing really. And I've given you a factor that might impact each of these. So I've given you interest rates, business confidence, fiscal policy, exchange rates, and domestic economic growth. Okay, now you're going to need to define each of these key terms and think about how they impact each of these factors of GDP. Okay? You should know what consumption is. That's just people buying stuff. Business investment or capital investment, that's businesses spending money on big items. Government spending, well, that's easy enough to work out, but you need to think about where the money comes from government. Well, they're either going to get it from taxation or they're going to get it from borrowing. Okay, so when you buy a government bond, for example, and I know a 3 or a 5 year bond, that is borrowing on the government's part. Okay, then we've got exports and we've got imports. So it'd be X minus N in the formula. So you've got your net exports. So exchange rates, for example, how does that impact? So you've done exchange rates in the lower sixth, you should know what that is. And domestic economic growth, well, we would measure that by GDP, but domestic economic growth from imports. Well, if we get too many imports, How does that impact our growth? If we don't get enough imports of cheaper goods, how does that impact our disposable income to spend on other things? These factors work in tandem together sometimes, quite often, to be honest with you. Then I'd like you to draw the circular flow of income. Well, if you're in the classroom, there's a poster on the wall. If not, I'm sure you've got the power of Google. You can find a good map. And I want you to explain how this works. Then we're going to think about FDI. You can find out what FDI is. And then, as we know, economists even, don't really like people, so it's per capita, per person. And think about the motive that's mentioned there about targeting high GDP per capita countries. Another research task. Hopefully you're going to be doing this in pairs if you can find someone else that didn't attend the lesson. And off you go. Pause the video. I'll put some answers up for you. We've got our economic growth here, inflation, low unemployment, balance of payments. So if you think about exports minus imports, it links into the formula for GDP, and that's our balance of payments. So a government will always talk about they want to increase exports and get more manufacturing jobs is what they normally focus on, even though that's not where we make most of our money. I don't think politicians are daft enough to say, let's support the city, let's look after our bankers. Wouldn't go down well with the electorate. But yes, so more exports, less imports. But if we go down the protectionist route, there's a whole unit we'll do on protectionism, which is a policy protecting jobs. It might be that I shove 200% tax on every import of Tesla cars, for example, to boost our own domestic production of electric cars in the UK. Well, that might protect some jobs, but what it does is it puts the price of Teslas up for everyone. Now, if I really have to have a Tesla, which I don't, then I won't have enough money to spend on other things. This could negatively impact the economy. Okay, so that's the chain of argument that we'll explore when we do protectionism. So thinking about the factors, there's some notes for you. You can read through those, pause the video, read the notes, and feel free to add your own pros and cons. Here's our circular flow of income. Thank you to Tutor2U for this one. This is the poster we have up in our classroom. And the way that we explain this is households work for firms. And what they get in return for working is they'll get their wages. If they own shares in the company, they'll get dividends. They'll get interest on their bank accounts because the banks loan my savings to companies. Maybe they'll get profits from the company themselves. They might be not only shareholders, they might own small companies, for example. They might own part of the building that the businesses operate in. I'm sure that part of my pension pot owns property, so I will get rent from that indirectly. So that all goes in. That's income for households. What do households do with their money? Well, they buy stuff. Now, the firms and the households pay taxes. Okay, the taxes go into government. Then we need to think about, well, what does the government do? Well, they might spend money on education programs which help improve households, which hopefully helps them to go to university and get a good job. They also will fill potholes. So they'll purchase repairing the roads, for example, from a construction company. So it's those sorts of things we need to think about. So the more taxation, the more government can spend on social transfers. This is one of the main motives behind charging independent schools 20% VAT on their school fees, so they can get extra taxes from independent schools. Then the money can be spent on more teachers helping state schools. Okay, that's the basics. So exports, obviously that's money coming into the economy. That's why the arrow is coming in. We're sending stuff out of the UK and people are giving us money the money comes into the UK, and this helps, it comes into firms obviously, and this helps the economy to grow. If we are importing, then the money is leaking from households or firms out of the economy to the rest of the world, and that money goes out. Too much exports, the economy shrinks, and if we get too many imports, the economy shrinks. Too many exports, and not too many, but we will grow. Trying to get this balance of payments right is important. We import a lot more than we export. Okay, but remember, if we're buying cheap stuff from India, for example, a pair of chinos from Marks and Spencer's are made in Bangladesh probably, then they're very good at textile working. Their per hour rate is a lot less than it would be in the UK. My chinos that I buy for work are about 25 quid. Well, if they were made in Northampton, for example, then maybe they would be 50 quid. That would mean I'd have 25 quid less to spend on other stuff. I've got my cheap chinos, I'm happy with them, and I've got the extra money to go and spend it maybe, I don't know, down the pub watching football. If only we would have won that one, hey? Well done, lads, to get through to the final. So, here's our roles. Here's some notes for you. You can copy, paste, or use your own version. And I've explained flows of income, for example, which I described briefly. And we can think about the expanded model, which is obviously including the rest of the world. Moving on. Foreign direct investment, you need to think of this as money from outside of the economy. Okay, so this could be SoftBank, the Japanese investment bank, recently bought a Cambridge-based tech company for 500 million quid. That 500 million pounds comes into the UK, probably. This helps the economy grow by 500 million pounds. Now, they are, at the moment, they're still listed on the FTSE 100, not FTSE 100, but they're in the FTSE stock exchange. Now, what's going to happen, hopefully, is they stay there. If they stay there, then the SoftBank, Japanese, hopefully will invest more money in this tech company. That money comes into the UK. Think of this as an import of money. Just that money itself helps the economy to grow. You then need to think about, what do they do with the money? Well, maybe they build a new building. Maybe they invest in training. All of these things help the economy to grow. Now, the new building might be a state-of-the-art manufacturing facility. It might be that they've brought in technology that we don't currently have in the UK. This then helps with skills transfer to other companies to help improve productivity, because the workers get trained up at this tech company. A job's not for life anymore, and they go and work for someone else. Hopefully this improves the other companies in the UK as well. So we need to think about this circular flow of income. Where's the money going? But also the skills transfer and the knowledge that comes with FDI. Just coming into the UK with the 500 million quid helps the economy to grow. But then what happens with the money? So here's some notes for you. Oops. Pause the video and update your notes a little bit. We can talk about this a bit more in depth in clinic. So, another research task for you. Okay, so I don't want, even though the spec says why would we target high GDP countries, we also need to think about why we might target low GDP per capita countries. Now, we know what the formula is for GDP. If we knew the total amount of the population, in the UK it's about 68 million people, then we would take GDP and we would divide it by 68 million people. That gives us the average GDP per person or per capita. So we've got that, and if that figure is low or lower than the UK, for example, we might think that the the majority of people have got lower purchasing power. Okay, and purchasing power is how much they can afford to spend on stuff. So it might be that in different countries we have different pricing strategies, for example. So when Pepsi first went into India, they were selling cans of Pepsi for the equivalent of about 5p. It was a while ago, by the way. And let's say it was 50p in the UK at the time. Now, it's the same can of Pepsi. Why were they doing that? Well, Pepsi is a mass market product. Therefore, it needs to appeal to the masses. Therefore, it needs to be priced accordingly. And if Pepsi didn't do that and they just went in with a higher price, maybe they would be seen as a more luxurious product. That's not their brand. And also, what are Coke doing at the same time? Maybe Coca-Cola are coming in and pricing it at 5p to get that mass market loyalty. Now, as the Indian economy grows, then the GDP per capita grows, hopefully the average earnings grow, then the average mass market consumer, maybe they're more willing to pay more for their can of Pepsi. A can of Pepsi is not 5p anymore. Excuse me. So think about this. It might be you go in with a different pricing strategy. Remember your pricing strategies from the lower sixth. This could be classed as penetration pricing. Now, the price going back up, as we know, penetration pricing is going low and put it up when you've got loyal customers. That going up factor might take decades. Okay, so you need to think about it. It might be that it's localized. In some cities, Pepsi is more expensive, and maybe in the more rural areas where the wages are lower, then maybe we will have a lower price. Okay, so it could be that Pepsi just subsidize the price when they pass it on to the resellers. So I want you to go away and I want you to research both of these, and you can see I've given you some headings to think about. I've not just said go away and think about motives, because all you'll do is you'll ask ChatGPT what the answer is. Use these headings, which means you need to define, for example, market expansion, and you need to define growth. Now, growth is a common hook in an exam question. So if you think about what growth is, well, we can obviously link that into, could be GDP, for example. It could be growth of market share. Pepsi selling more cans of pop than Coca-Cola. Go away, define all the key terms, a bit of pros and cons in there if you want to, and think about the why. Pause the video, do the research. So here's some answers for you. They're not the only answers, and we've got terms like emerging economies, low GDP, rapidly growing economies, and this is how we would define an emerging market. Well, if it's rapidly growing, then more people are earning money, hopefully, that more people aspire for, in this case, in our Pepsi example, the taste of America, maybe, however it's branded to the consumer. Okay. Also, it might be that they are not in that market already. So Ansoff would say, here's an opportunity, even though it's a bit risky. And it might be that they are the first in the market, the first to have a Western Coke experience. Then maybe they can get that brand loyalty for the future. Okay, there's a risk of being a first mover advantage. You might be the first for a reason. Maybe it's too risky. It might be that actually this really works out for you. Remember Amazon's targets when they first went into India. It was not profitability. Amazon were looking for first sales, repeat sales, and reliable delivery. And they knew that the combination of those three would result in the future for profitability, which is what they see in their cash cow markets like the UK and the US at the moment, where generally Amazon are not the cheapest in the marketplace anymore. They've used penetration pricing. Some would argue that they've used predatory pricing, but they weren't found guilty of that, so it's penetration. There we go. Cost advantages. It could be that we're making stuff in the country. Resources, it might be that they're cheaper in those countries compared to more established companies. We might need to change those. We'll talk about localization and a term called glocalization in another unit. and maybe there's specific tastes. It could be that we just change the pricing strategy. It could be in the case of canned soda, there's different sugar content. Coca-Cola is not the same recipe around the world. They change it for the local markets. CSR we will talk a lot about. I will leave you to read the rest of the notes. Pause the video, read the notes, and what you should be adding into your notes, which is what we would do in class, is the advantages and disadvantages to these. Okay? So it's really important you get pros and cons for everything in your notes. So, quick bit of recall. Hopefully you can now regurgitate the formula. If we're in class, I'm sure a couple of you would get whiplash looking at the formula that's written on the wall. We're now sharing Mr. Cawthorne's classroom, so he teaches economics. So we've definitely got the formula somewhere. And we're on to a 12 marker. So we're going to do a couple of essays, and here is a past paper question for you. So the first thing we're going to do is, this is the first exam style question that we've done of the upper sixth, is we are going to remind ourselves of how to plan. So we are going to think about assess the likely impact. Yep, so we know that this is our hook on UK, on the UK. So this is a country-based question, second part of the hook, of Ford's decision to move production to Turkey. So they're moving it away from Southampton to Turkey, which means they're not making the transit vans in the UK anymore. This is a country-based question, which means you need to remind yourself of your macroeconomic objectives. Okay, I'll give you a minute or so to read, well, pause the video and read the case study and think about this from a macroeconomic perspective. Hopefully you pause the video. Now, if we look through here, we've got Ford plans to move its Southampton production of transit vans to Turkey, which means they won't be making them in Southampton anymore. The car company announced the closure of its 2 UK production facilities, leading to job losses of 1,400 jobs in Britain. Okay, so this is 1,400 jobs. Think about your circular flow of income. They're not working for the firms anymore. They're not getting paid, which means they're not spending money, and also they're not giving taxes to the UK government. Okay, think about, imagine, visualize that circular flow of income. Ford says that it was switching production to Turkey because of costs lower elsewhere. The company has produced transit vans in Southampton for 40 years. Okay, so I'm going to underline that because that's important, because these 1,400 people, they haven't worked there for 40 years probably, but they're going to be experienced production workers. The planned closures will significantly hurt the local economy, well, it's telling us something we need, and the supply chain will be badly hit. Up to 10,000 jobs will be at risk. Okay, now those of you with advanced math skills, there's 10,000 plus 1,400. Okay, we always look for opportunities to do some basic maths. So we understand that there's that many jobs, and look, actually, this is the direct cost, this is the indirect cost because of people supplying tyres and engines and sandwiches and logistics and all the other things that are there as well. Okay, however, Ford still uses Britain to develop specialist engines. Okay, so this is possibly a bit of a however to one of my points. So I'd like you to think about this from macroeconomic objective perspective and list at least 2 macroeconomic objectives that you could use in this question. Think about the formula of GDP, because obviously if you're using GDP as one of your points, then you could use the language from the formula. You're not going to put the formula of GDP into this answer, but you could talk about something that's in there. I've already given you some tips have linked into the language of GDP. And how could this impact the circular flow in the local economy and possibly the national economy? Remember, this is on the UK. It's not just on Southampton. So we need to make sure we're answering the question. Write your 12 marker. Do you remember the structure of a 12 marker? I'm sure that you do, but just in case, we're obviously looking at AP. It could be however, in favour, could positively impact the economy. Yeah, this is not all about doom and gloom. You're going to write a second P paragraph, not good for the economy, however it might be good. And then we're going to answer the question and we're going to justify our answer. Remember, we can't suddenly turn around and say the alternative with this one. We can't say, however, if they decided to leave the vans here. So we need to think about the future. Your justification is future orientated. Okay, we don't write a separate MOPS statement, but the acronym MOPS could help you with that future orientated one. Okay, write your 12 marker, do it in 15 minutes, make sure you underline the connectives and make sure you quote the case study at least once in each of your P paragraphs. Remember, your conclusion also needs to be contextualised, as does your justification. So, moving on, here's an example answer from a student, and your job is to mark this using the marking grid. Now remember, we're not aiming for perfection, we're aiming for level 4. So we're looking for accurate knowledge and understanding in context throughout. We're looking for a minimum of 3 chains of argument. Now preferably with the however paragraph, we're going to have 5. That's what we're looking for the top here. But if you get everything else and you've only done 3 chains of argument, then you're still going to get bottom level 4. We definitely need to make sure it's balanced, so make sure you're not just talking about doom and gloom, because if you have not got a balanced answer, we will cap you at half marks, probably putting you down to level 2. So go very careful. If it's not balanced, you might get 4 marks out of 12. Wide-ranging arguments, yeah, well, that means more than 2, by the way, and as we know, if you're following this structure, then you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, possibly 5. Yeah, remember, MOPS is not a separate statement, it just helps you with your justification. It shows an awareness of competing arguments, so that justification needs to be contextualised. And we've got a supported judgment. Supported is not just a repeat of your answer. You won't get the marks twice, so make sure your conclusion adds something a bit more. So walking through this, Ford's decision to move its production to Turkey will result in a loss of 1,400 manufacturing jobs. Application. I've underlined the connectives for you, which is what you should be doing to make the examiner's life easy. And so you remember you've done it. This may impact the local area of Southampton context in terms of unemployment, especially as this will have impacted local suppliers who may lose significant contracts, impacting employment with 10,000 jobs at risk. Loads of application. It's very easy to write this if you use the case study properly. Okay. However, Ford's engineers may find other jobs given their specialised skills producing transit vans. Now, I've not just said Ford's workers might find other jobs. That would be a bit rubbish, by the way. We've got engineers. I'm sure they've got other workers, by the way, but we do love a highly skilled engineer. And if they're specialised, highly skilled engineers, they might use the skills elsewhere. Okay, so transit vans is more context. It's a lot easier than building products, which is a bit rubbish, by the way, so don't do it. On to our second one. Ford will continue to use the UK as a centre of excellence. Okay, so up here we've got a negative with a however. Down here we've got a positive, and hopefully this is a negative however. Oh look, it's used the word negatively. Signposting the examiner, making it really obvious, yeah. However, Ford will continue to use the UK as a centre of excellence, which could encourage further investment, employment, and specialist training to the Southampton area, helping the area develop world-class reputation for building specialist engine parts, not products. Yeah. So the case study is very specific, so we may as well use it. Helping create highly skilled, highly paid jobs in the future. This is a macroeconomic objective, yeah? Low unemployment and building that GDP per capita up. If we're highly skilled, highly paid, helps the economy. However, Ford's move will negatively impact GDP due to, as a macro goal obviously, less production of van exports, not products, and the loss of jobs. This might impact consumption, the language of GDP, in the local Southampton economy. Okay? Remember, its impact on the UK, not just Southampton. So we've talked about the UK, sort of, and we've talked about, obviously, that's the UK, by the way, and we've talked about Southampton. Overall, nice way to start your conclusion. You'll notice I've got spaces here, segmenting it, making it easy to mark. If it's easy to mark, it's easy to give you the marks, yeah? So underline your connectives, make it obvious that you've used the case study. I would encourage you to use quotation marks. I forgot to do it here. I do apologise. Ford's decision to move to Turkey and close its van production in the Southampton is bad for the UK economy. I needed to make a decision. Yeah. So what's the impact? It's bad. It's not a very good word for a business essay, but it does answer the question. Now, the rest of the marks, probably about 3 or 4 of them, are going to be for your justification. So if you think about it, your total conclusion is nearly the same size as your paragraph point. This needs to add something a little bit more and not just a repeat. Let's see if we've achieved it. Losing a manufacturer that directly impacts employment and the employment of the supply chain will probably result in negative GDP growth in Southampton area and possibly across the UK. Okay, that is very much a repeat of the answer. It sounds like it's all right. It sort of says this is not good, but that's what we've already said in the answer. Unless other sectors grow in the future. Now, yes, that's interesting, and yes, that's one of those it depends on factors that we would see in exam technique videos. There's nothing really new there, to be honest with you. Now, is it level 4? Yeah, it is level 4. It's fully contextualised. Yeah, it's good use of theory throughout, lovely use of those macro objectives. It's contextualised to death. It's lovely. We've got lovely chains of argument, at least 5 in the paragraphs. It does answer the question. It is balanced. It is wide-ranging. Yeah, it uses quant and qual very well, but does it support the judgment? I don't think it does, to be honest with you. So let's give it 9 or 10. Yeah, we'll be generous today and we'll give this a 10. There you go. Now, to improve this, when we're thinking about what we could possibly do, and maybe we could talk more about in context with this, it might be that we bring in a bit of our own knowledge. This was part of the research theme paper, which was the UK manufacturing industry. So it could be that we bring in a bit of our own knowledge to add something to this. For a 12 marker, that's acceptable. Don't do it for 8 or a 10. Definitely not a 4. Okay? So we might bring in a little bit of knowledge that we know about, I don't know, Jaguar Land Rover in Midlands. If the workers in Southampton are willing to move to the Midlands, then they might be able to secure themselves highly paid jobs. Something like that. Anyway, group task. Moving away from cars, let's move towards coffee. So analyse 2 reasons why Costa might choose to charge higher prices in China than in the UK. Now, this is very much a country as a market question, which we'll do a whole unit on. But go away and I want you to research some factors on these countries. Remember, you've had the link to the CIA fact book. Don't just default to our good friend ChatGPT or Google. Why would you use Google anymore? You can go away and find some research. Remember, we need evidence on both of these countries. Okay, so we've got UK, we've got China. I'm expecting you to compare and contrast some data. It's only an 8 marker, which means we only really need 2 pieces of evidence here. Okay, concise 8 markers, and this time we're aiming hopefully for full marks. 8 markers are very easy, and also they're a time trap, remember. You need to get this done in 10 minutes. The research will take you a bit longer than that, by the way, so I'll probably give you 20 minutes in class to do this. I don't want you to write a load. I want you to write 3 chains of argument and a however, and make sure it's contextualised. Remember, your howevers also need to be contextualised. And if they're not, they're abstract, they don't count. Okay? Go away and do your research and come back. Pause the video. Moving on. Now, what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to mark this 8 marker. Okay, now we know what structure we're roughly looking for. We know we're looking for 3 chains of argument. So I'd like you to underline them in your example. You can screenshot this and shove this into Word or something. And I'd like you to think, we're obviously aiming for level 3. And ideally, what we need to do is we need to get full marks. If you get full marks on your 8 markers, they're only in paper 3. In paper 1 and 2, you're aiming for full marks on your 4 markers. If you get that, that's 16% of each of the papers. Okay? Then, if you get level 4 on all of your other essays, you're going to get yourself an A or an A star. So, to do that, you need to make sure you don't spend too much time on these easy 8 markers. So this is about the length of an 8 marker, roughly. You might write it a little bit more concise than this, but you don't want to be writing much more. Pause the video and mark it. Here we go. So we're looking for 2 reasons, and we obviously want to make this nice and easy to mark. So one reason, another reason, and you'll see that there's spaces to make sure we're segmenting our answers to make it easy to mark. A sea of text is a bit more difficult to mark. Examiners mark very, very quickly. I'm sure they're all perfect and brilliant, but if you make their lives easy, then actually you've got a better chance of getting the marks. My advice is you underline your connectives, you put quotation marks around evidence, or you just make it really bloody obvious that you've used the case study. So things like 364 stores, now I'm not sure that needs quotation marks around it because it's a bit obvious. It's numerical, they can see that. However, if it was the hot drinks market, let's say that was taken from a case study, then I would put quotation marks around that. I would also be underlining the connectives. So one reason that Costa might choose to charge higher prices in the UK, in China than the UK, is that they only have that in the UK. That's my point. Therefore, this makes the European cafe more exclusive and niche. This is using a bit of application because it's using some knowledge. Up here, we've got application marks as well, which gives us a connective added value, okay, more application of theory to their cafe for Chinese consumer, leading to consumers being willing to pay more in China than in the UK, where Costa, that's another one, are a common occurrence at most service stations. So we're basically saying very mass market, crowded market in the UK versus China, where it might be seen as a bit new. Bit of an old case study, it's not quite like that now. Okay, so we've got at least 3 chains of argument. I didn't mean to write 5 in there, it's just the way it came. We've definitely got evidence in there, and actually we've got application of theory in the middle of it as well, which is classed as application. We've then gone to a new line and we've written however. However is signifying a counter-argument. Leaving a space makes it easy to see the counter-argument. With Starbucks already having a big presence in the Chinese hot drink market, Chinese consumers might not see a European cafe as exclusive anymore. Time-based argument. Therefore, Costa's high prices might lead to slower growth. Up here, more niche. Down here, not so much niche anymore. Maybe customers become more price sensitive. Okay? Another reason, because remember we need two reasons, Costa might choose to charge higher prices, is that they experience higher overall costs operating in China than in the UK. That's my point. This could be due to import taxation between China and the UK, losing money on exchange rates and higher transportation costs, as China is a much larger country. We're comparing the countries, remember, which is not as developed as the UK. Not sure if I agree with that, by the way. So transport links, another connective, might not be as robust and effective as those in the UK. Therefore, Costa may choose to pass those extra costs onto the consumer to keep a healthy profit margin. Okay, hopefully this evidence has come from a case study, and we do know that Costa have got a very established supply chain in the UK, and they're everywhere, so they will have the economies of scale of centralised supply chain, and China is a much bigger country. Okay? What's missing? You should be screaming one word at the screen. It's the however. Okay? Now, if you miss one however off and everything else is in context and answers the question, then you're going to lose 1 mark, and maybe this means you get 7 out of 8. I'm going to presume that this is all recall. This whole argument here has just been blabbed by the student and just made up the entire thing. Okay? Up here, it's obvious that they have used a case study. Down here is less obvious. Now, that means that we go to the standards. So accurate and thorough knowledge and understanding supported throughout by relevant, well, not really supported throughout, is it? Yep, throughout means throughout last time I checked. So let's move up to level 2. Applied accurately to the business and its context. Well, I think it is, but it doesn't say throughout on there, does it? So for application, because of this, we're in level 2 territory. Now, the assessment is balanced. Well, not 100%, because actually there's a however missing here. So it might be unbalanced and unlikely to show the significance of competing arguments. Well, we know that we're not worried about that, because that means a conclusion. We know they crossed that out in the original standards. But think about it. We're missing a however, and it's not contextualised throughout. Well, what would probably happen with this, because this is absolutely fine, by the way, this on its own is worth 4 marks, you're probably going to get 5 out of 8, depending on the mood of the examiner, maybe 6 out of 8. Okay? Make it obvious that you're using the case study and follow the guidelines of how to write an 8 marker. So, now I'd like you to plan a 20 marker. This is why this is better that you turned up to the lesson, because there's so much work. Okay, if you get stuck on this one, then we can help you in clinic. This is the 20 marker that I mentioned earlier in the video, if you were listening. And first of all, we need to plan this, and then you can go in and find the evidence. So the Government of Ireland supports the location of multinationals such as Pfizer. First of all, such as Pfizer. We need to think about who Pfizer are. This is a tech company. They're a pharmaceutical company. They're going to have highly skilled, biological scientists or something. So we're talking about such as. This is a tech company. This is also a multinational that sells their drugs around the world. You've all heard of Pfizer because of COVID. And obviously this case study was before COVID and some students had never heard of it. Well, read the case study and it tells you exactly how to do this. Okay, so plan this, use it, and link in macroeconomic objectives after a short break because of my delivery. Anyway, so we're moving on to one of the other measures that are in this unit. So we're looking at other things that we could measure to indicate economic growth or potential for trade. So when we look at the HDI index, you've done this in geography, if any of you are geographers, it's one of those measures that looks at health, education, and standard of living. So we don't need to really worry about the GNI. PPP is, here's the definition for it, is thinking about that purchasing power of our consumers. So back onto the example of Pepsi. Pepsi mass market needs to be accessible to the mass markets, which means you might need different pricing strategies in different marketplaces. So as the economy grows, then the average earnings grow, then maybe the tolerance for the average worker mass market to buy a can of Pepsi increases, therefore you can get away with charging more money. Those sorts of things are really important. When we're looking at education, it could be that this is the education of our workers. This could be the education of the people buying our cans of Pepsi. Can they read our advertising? Yep, so it could be something as basic as literacy, which is something that we will do a separate slide on because it's one of the bullet points in the Edexcel standards. So if you think about it, that's very important. Now, life expectancy is also very important. So back to our Pfizer example, they're going to be selling medicines. So at the moment, the most profitable companies on the planet are either AI-related technology companies or healthcare. The most profitable company in the UK, in Europe at the moment is the company that invented the injection to help with obesity, or to reduce obesity anyway. So you have to think about, when we get older, we have more complex health problems. When we get older, hopefully we've got more money because we've been saving all of our lives, which means if we're living longer and we want a good quality of life, great for healthcare companies. Okay, think about that. So you've got your definition of PPP over here, and it's comparing that purchasing parity with others. And it won't surprise you that a can of Pepsi in the UK is significantly more expensive than it will be in India still. However, in the future, we will see. Now, in class, we would have gone through this. I want you to think about answering these questions. Think about how you can link in the stats from HDI, and again, make sure you are defining the key terms. You'll notice that most of these you've already done before. When I've talked about competitive advantage here, I want you to use the language of Porter's generic strategies. Yeah, Porter's generic matrix, as mentioned in the Edexcel standards. Go careful, don't get it mixed up with Ansoff. So we've talked about CSR. CSR, there should be a bracket there. CSR could be very important to your consumers in a country. It could be that how you treat the people in that emerging market impacts your consumers back home. Yeah, we saw that with Primark, for example. Primark, there's that horrible factory fire in Bangladesh where I think 1,500 people died as the building collapsed because they wouldn't let them out of it whilst it was on fire. And there was public uproar, remember. Then Primark decided to invest a lot of money in putting pressure on their supply chain to be more ethical. You go into Primark and they talk about Cotton Alliance jeans. They'll talk about how much they invest in their supply chain. Okay? We'll talk about that more in depth. But they've had to focus a lot on their corporate social responsibility and ethical purchasing practices throughout the entire supply chain. Because if not, if they have another Rana Plaza disaster, consumers might not go to them, even though Next, for example, will buy their clothes from probably the same region as do Marks and Spencer's, maybe even from the same factory, but nobody really likes Primark, so they're quite an easy target in the press. So go in and think about why these statistics are important to UK companies, and also think about the pros and cons. Okay, research task, pause the video, crack on. Right, so here's some answers without the pros and cons. Okay, so you can have a look through this, and even if you're just copying the stuff off the slides, I sort of expect you to make sure that you've done pros and cons for all of these as well. Okay, it shouldn't take you long. If you do this often enough, you'll be able to do it when you do your exam over the summer, hey? So, moving on, in pairs, or on your own if you missed a lesson, explain why understanding literacy levels in emerging markets is crucial for UK firms. Okay, putting on the right glasses might be also quite essential. So, we've got our key terms. You should be able to define all of these off the top of your head, or at least describe them. And we're thinking about this from a literacy levels perspective. This time, we're coming towards the end of the presentation, you'll be happy to hear. And we need to think about all of these things. It's not just, oh, at least staff can read the health and safety instructions when they're making stuff, or when they're delivering things. It could be simply, if you've got high levels of literacy, that the local economy is easier to integrate more technology. It's all well and good having cheaper labour making my jeggings for Marks and Spencer's, but excuse me, if because of poor education standards they don't know how to use the machinery properly, or the technology that you try and bring in is so much further advanced than all the other local technology, your workers might need significant training. It might be worth just paying a little bit more per hour and getting your stuff made in Vietnam, for example. So you've got to think about these things, and don't underestimate the importance of literacy. It's in the bullet point for this unit, so it could be a direct essay question as well. So you need to be able to do this. So don't rush through this activity just because it's the last one in the unit, and make sure again that you've got pros and cons. Okay, for example, if the local economy has a average age of schooling, I don't know, let's say they leave school at 12 years old on average, which is quite common in some emerging markets. It might be that those with good literacy skills are actually in the minority. If you want those people, then maybe you have to pay above the average wage. So if you're given an average wage figure in a case study, it doesn't mean that you're going to get highly skilled engineers for the average wage. So just understand the averages and how averages work. Okay? Pause the video, complete the activity. Hopefully you pause the video. Moving on. Here are some points. I'll let you copy those, pause the video, and here's the rest of it. Not the most engaging end to a video, I apologise, but you're only watching this video if you've missed the first couple of lessons, because some students have a habit of coming back to school late even though they're in an exam year. So here endeth 4.1.1, probably the biggest unit in the entire A level, often directly tested, very often indirectly tested as part of another unit. Okay, we've talked extensively about the formula for GDP, for example. We've talked about macroeconomic objectives. Now, if you look through these bullet points, it doesn't say anything about learning GDP formula. If you look in the textbook, it doesn't talk about the GDP formula. Now, some of you might think, well, it's not in the textbook. Why are we learning it? Well, most other schools do. Okay, circular flow of income is not in the textbook, but it is lower sixth macroeconomics if you're studying economics last year. So if you think about it, just because it's not in the textbook doesn't mean we shouldn't learn it. Okay, it's very important. We're not teaching you above the standards. It's just that these standards evolve over the years. Hopefully that was useful. It was a very long video. Well done if you've got this far. And remember, our academic clinics are there. All of you have got a link to my diary. So if you want a one-to-one meeting or a number of them, because it's such a big unit, you're most welcome to book yourself an appointment and come and meet me in Croft. Okay, have a good afternoon, everyone.